one idea does not make a plot. If it is only one idea, sometimes that's just a short story. So today I wanted to do a sort of updated book brainstorming process video. A while ago, I did a two-part video where I talked about how I brainstorm books, how I plan out book ideas and all that kind of stuff. A lot of that is still applicable, it's still relevant, I still do those things, but my process has shifted a little bit. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about all the things that I do prior to actually drafting a book. So this involves the brainstorming, it involves outlining, how I basically get all of my notes together. I am a pretty staunch outliner. I feel like that's important to say right off the bat because I don't think that all writing advice and all writing processes are a one fit sort of thing. If you prefer to discovery write, I think some of this more nitpicky, in the weeds stuff might not be as interesting or helpful or relevant. But if you do like outlining, or if you are thinking of implementing outlining into your process, I hope some of this can be helpful. Even though I do take a lot of early notes, I do consider the early part of my brainstorming process to be very chaotic, and I have learned to love and embrace that chaos. When I get a book idea, I don't write it right away. I will usually sit on the idea for a while to kind of just think about it a little bit longer. Not all your ideas are going to come to you all at once. You're going to be inspired by other things that you encounter, other books that you read, other stories that you consume. Every book is different. I always tweak things with every book that I start. So my process is never going to be set in stone. This is just what it looks like right now. This is sort of the iteration that I have done that I really like. The first thing when you're starting to write a book is you have an idea. Most times you will have multiple ideas. I usually will come up with like random ideas for things that it isn't a plot, it's just an idea. Sometimes if I'm lucky it's a premise, but I will write it down somewhere, usually in my notes app. I just keep like a running list of things that I like. It could be just like a random idea for a character, it could be a world building thing, it could be a trope. Just things that I'm really excited by. I let myself sit on it for a while to see if in a few weeks I'm still excited by it. One idea does not make a plot. If it is only one idea, sometimes that's just a short story. Make sure that I have enough interesting ideas, and then when I go back to my notes app and I see that I've made a list of something, I will start looking at that list and deciding I think those things could be connected in an interesting way. For example, I wrote a fantasy book called Nightward. I'm completely revising this book and writing it from the ground up. It is no longer called Nightward. The plot has completely changed. I will talk about it in a future video, but just to use it as an example. Before I started writing Nightward, I had collected a bunch of ideas over the course of like several weeks. The main one was that I knew I wanted to do something related to a fighting ring. That's kind of like a fantasy trope that I've always wanted to do. I was also really interested in Filipino folklore, so that was another idea that I put into my notes app. I also wrote down a sort of like reluctant allies, friends to lovers trope with a dual protagonist. I was also interested in tackling kind of what it means to live through a very unstable political climate and what it means to be on the fringes of a revolutionary movement. I think the first attempt was valiant. I had a lot of fun writing it. It is a book that is close to my heart. It is not a book that is as thematically mature as I wanted it to be, so it's why I'm completely rewriting it, and a lot of those ideas are changing, but also a lot of them are staying the same. Obviously, when I list out all of those ideas, those things are not a plot in and of themselves. But what I did was, once I had that like long list of things that I liked, I went into a Google Doc, Microsoft Word doc, whatever you use. So this is the part of my brainstorming process that never changes. I have a brain dump document. That's usually the first thing that I do. There are some projects where I've done this by hand as well, like in a notebook, but essentially it's just what it sounds like. I just write whatever comes to my head, flesh out more ideas, and I don't care about organizing them or anything like that. I just try to like let the spirit move me, you know what I mean? Once I have a pretty sizable brain dump doc, this is when I will zoom out and look at what I've written, start to see whether or not there is a shape for a story here. I think this is one of those things that I have a difficult time explaining. Like, I don't think there's any kind of mathematical equation to decide whether or not a story is like ready and worth writing. I think it's just an instinct, a vibe that you start to develop as a writer, as you become more comfortable in your own writing style. I feel like I know myself enough as a writer that I can feel getting really excited about a story because I start to get ideas for scenes. I think about all of my stories in scenes. I think it's part of why I'm such an outliner, is because every time I come up with an idea for something, I'm already trying to craft the scene for how it will be portrayed. I treat all my chapters as having like a beginning, middle, end, and I always kind of write with that feeling of wanting a singular chapter to not necessarily be its own contained story, but to feel like it is certainly moving. The other thing is that I always leave a little like spot at the end of my whatever document I'm writing in I literally just call it miscellaneous. Sometimes I call it parking lot, or I just call it random ideas. If I get like an idea for a scene, I'll make sure that I write it down, and sometimes I'll use it, sometimes I won't use it. I have like a super chaotic brain in these early stages. I make sure that whatever comes to my head is being written down, because even if I don't use it later, sometimes I do use it, and it's important to not forget things as they're coming up. So just let your own ride the wave of your own creativity. After I've looked at all my notes and I've decided, yeah, I think this could be a really interesting plot, I start to organize the notes. So usually I will make a fresh document for this. This is when I will actually start trying to be a little bit more coherent. So I'll take all of my ideas and I will split them up into world building, characters, theme, and then if it's a fantasy, 80% of the time it is magic system. Make all of my notes, basically. I will flesh out all of the details for my notes. So usually under world building, this is when I'm like trying to understand what is the geography of this world, their social classes, you know, all these kinds of things. I like to world build as deeply as possible, because once I drop my characters into the world, I want it to feel like this is a fully fleshed out world. If you are not writing a secondary world, this might not apply to you, but I like to overwrite in my notes, because even if I am writing things that I know are not going to make it into the plot, knowing that this thing about this world exists just makes my characters feel like they're living in a real place. If you're a writer, you're the god of your world, right? So I like to be omnipotent in this way. Usually at this point, I am coming up with all the backstories for my characters, and this is also the stage where I am fleshing out what I want my theme to be, or themes, multiple themes. I've always viewed theme as kind of a compass. I've viewed it as the argument that I'm trying to make. But I think in the most simpler terms, to me, theme is the purpose of the story. Like, it's the whole reason that you're telling the story, and by the end of it, you want your reader to feel like you have made a point about this theme. I spend a lot of time in this kind of organization stage making sure that as I'm coming up with character backstories, as I'm crafting the world, I'm starting to see how those two things could come together to strengthen what I want the themes to be. And sometimes I'll start tweaking the themes, but usually the theme is like first, and I'm crafting everything around the theme of the story. Because to me, if there's no themes, there's no plot. The theme is the foundation of the entire story. It dictates the decisions that the characters make. it dictates the way that the world treats them and how they view the world in return. And the character's decisions is what's gonna dictate what happens at the end of the book. All of this in the organization stage is really just me trying to take all these ideas and connect the dots. The next step in my process is, after I've organized my notes, after I've pretty much come up with the ideas for, if not all the characters, then I usually at this point know who my main characters are, and I know that they have at least, one motivation, one conflict. All kind of the main ideas are there. Some of the details might not be fleshed out yet, but I've come up with a world and I know who my characters are and I know how they want to be challenged. At this point, I will write a book blurb. A blurb is essentially what you see on the back of a book or on the inside flap. It is the pitch. It is the thing that you could imagine a reader reading when they're in the bookstore. So the reason that I write a blurb really early on in my writing process is because I want to know how easily the story could be pitched. I think it's 50% me thinking about publishing, but the other 50% of the reason that I do this is because it also gets me excited. I like to imagine, what it would be like to be a reader reading this blurb, and I will know 100% if it's time to write a book when I write the blurb and I'm like, ooh, I want to read this book. I wish it was written. I would highly recommend, writing a blurb for your book early on in your writing process. It's very motivating. Partly a reason for me to figure out if the idea is easy to communicate and to make sure that the stakes feel nice and high, or that the premise feels interesting. And then the other 50%, like I said, is just for my own personal enjoyment. And it's kind of a bit of a motivation boost for the rest of my outlining process. At this point, I will be trying to flesh out side characters. I will be trying to brainstorm subplots, and just adding in those random ideas for fleshing out the world and the plot and the characters. Start brainstorming beats. So I know a lot of writers use beat sheets. For me, I basically just at the top of my document, I will write out Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, and then I will do bullet points for each act. This is a way for me to see okay, what are all the main beats that happen in Act 1? Is there a hook at the end of Act 1 that propels the characters very interestingly into Act 2? What does the midpoint look like? What is the sort of midpoint twist? Act 3, what is the climax? And then Act 4 is usually just for me to figure out how I want everything to wrap up. At this point, I'm not writing out every single scene, but I'm just writing out ideas for things that I want to happen, so that when I finally do write out the full outline, I have a sense for the pacing, because sometimes I get really caught up in Act 1 and I just want to put everything in Act 1, and then I'm just oh, but nothing has happened yet. For me, writing the bullet points out under each act just helps me get a sense for pacing and seeing okay, these are all the main things that are happening, and making sure that the external plot is moving in a compelling but consistent way, just so that I'm not lingering too long in Act 1, and just so that Act 2 doesn't feel too rushed, and that there's a nice believable build up to some kind of climax in Act 3. That's just for me as a writer, because I tend to love writing Act 1, and then Act 2 I hate. A lot of writers, Act 2 that's when things start to kind of cave in the middle, and then you start rushing towards the end. I think what's really integral for me at this stage is my characters. If I have any lingering questions about the characters from the brainstorming stage, this is the point where I am really trying to figure out the main important questions about my main characters. So the things that I always want to know about my main characters, and usually significant side characters as well, is who are they at the start of the book? How do they feel? What are their thoughts towards the world and their circumstance? How are they challenged? Where are they at the end of the book? And what does the character represent about the theme of the story? The reason that I ask myself all these questions early on in the brainstorming process is because, again, these are going to dictate how your characters are making decisions. You want your readers to be convinced that these characters would be making these decisions in a believable way. You want to make sure your characters have some sense of agency. Even if you are writing a passive main character who doesn't necessarily want anything at the start of the book, you still want them to confront some kind of challenge, even if that challenge is just like a mental challenge. And you want to kind of make sure that you know what that thing is, so that it feels like your characters are their own people, and that, you know, you as a writer aren't just puppeteering them to do whatever you want them to do. So part of making sure that your characters have a sense of agency, making sure you know what their conflict is, and having the reader believe that the conflict, the challenge that they're facing and their motivation would clash in a convincingly interesting way. This is not to be confused with making your character likable. I know there's a lot of discussions around likable main characters, and there's a whole type of reader that will only connect with a character if they're relatable. That is not the mindset or the framework that I use. I don't think about my characters as, are they likable? I think about them as, do they feel fleshed out? Like, do they feel like full human beings, right? I try not to get caught up in things like likability because it's such a subjective thing, and I also don't think it's productive as a writer to have to feel like your character has to be representative of like everyone's experience and just a paragon of morality, because so many shades of gray there. Readers will connect with the character as long as they are interesting, and a lot of the things that make characters interesting are their flaws. So I throw likability out of the door. That's not to say that like you make characters mean for the sake of being mean, but I try to make sure that my characters are always like leveled out with some kind of flaw. My next step, and this is a new step that I have used for the current fantasy project that I'm writing right now, I have introduced the web method into my brainstorming process. Got the idea to do this because I was watching one of Shaylin Bishop's videos. I don't know why I never thought to do this, but it's actually a game changer for me because this is the final step of my organization. So I don't do this step like super on in my brainstorming process. I think you can if you want to, but for me, I like to do this as a last step. Once I have all of my notes kind of written out in a Google Doc, I will transfer them onto a Miro board. Usually at this point, this is like me finally brushing up all the notes and making sure everything's clean, everything's easy for me to read. So this more or less just involves me kind of copying, pasting everything. It sounds very tedious. I'm not saying that you have to do this many iterations of your notes. I get it. Sounds like a ton of work. It is, but I like it. And I think as I do it, it makes me come up with more ideas for the story. So for me, it is productive time, but every writer is going to be different. Was drawn to this kind of web method is that I found with my previous projects, and even as I was writing my notes out for this new fantasy book, that I kept having to like scroll up and down my document to kind of get to all the sections, and it's just not as efficient. So transferring everything onto essentially a big Miro board just lets me see all my notes all at once. It's easier for me to navigate. It looks messy, but to me it is not. I know where everything is, and I can also very clearly see all the different ideas that connect. The other big thing for me is that I feel like it's with the web method, I can come up with subplots a lot more easily, because I think there's something that feels very linear about just like a typical Word document, because it's kind of like that straight line scroll, so you're kind of only thinking about one thing at once, and then when you get an idea you have to kind of like scroll back up to the section to which that applies and all that kind of stuff. And you have everything kind of sprawled out, you have a bird's eye view, you can see the entire board all at once. It's just easier for me to move through sections. If I come up with ideas for like a subplot for a side character, I can, make a note about that and make sure that it's connecting to the things to which that idea would apply to, if that makes sense. For this project, I split it up into the same main sections, like world building, magic system, character, and then I have some notes on the side about theme, and then I kind of transfer over my beats for Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. Once I feel like the board is filled out, I have all my notes in. Usually at this point, this is when I am filling in the details for my side characters. The book in particular has quite a big cast. It is bigger than I usually do. Not all of them have like a ton of screen time, but I like to know the details of all those characters. And so at this sort of stage, I'm trying to make sure that I know what purpose all the characters are serving. Or if I want this character to kind of like have their own agency, they will usually be like a primary driver of a subplot. So for me, I like to organize my characters into like primary, secondary, and tertiary. So the primary characters are the main characters. For this book, there's 2 of them. The secondary characters are characters who, like I said, are driving their own subplot. So there might be some interlude chapters that are in their perspective, just a few of them scattered throughout the book. And then tertiary characters are characters that I don't plan for them to have really an arc. They don't have any scenes in their perspective. They are really just there to serve the arcs of a secondary or main character. So for this book, it's like one of the main characters has a little sibling. So the things that happen to them in this book and how they kind of evolve, the focus of it is meant to be a reflection of the main character. So they're not really their own full character. Other characters that might be in the tertiary character are characters that are going to die. So they are there in the story, but I know that their fate is to not make it to the end of the story. So their arc essentially is not really an arc, but it is a beat that is meant to serve the arc of a secondary or the main character. And it is time to outline. So the other main change that I have made to my outlining process for this book that I'm writing right now, and I kind of do like this, so I might keep it. After I've written out all my notes, they are organized. I am like ready to actually outline the plot. I write a synopsis. So based on all of the beats that I have written out for Act 1 to Act 4, I will write a nice long synopsis. Typically, this will be about 3 or 4 pages. It just covers the main plot, start to finish. This has really helped me see the full shape of a story before I start writing, just so that I can kind of get that bird's eye view. Typically in the synopsis, the things that I'm leaving out are the subplots. So I'm really just focusing on like the main beats. So it's kind of like taking my beat sheet and fleshing it out. Once I have a synopsis written, and a synopsis spoils the beginning, middle, end of the book, now it is time for me to write a chapter by chapter outline. So this is where I am literally going, chapter 1, this is what happens. Chapter 2, this is what happens. If you are not an outliner, this might sound crazy, like all these steps that I'm doing. Personally, I love it. I love the feeling of organizing. I love the feeling of going into a draft, having a roadmap. And that's not to say that I don't deviate from the outline, because I do. Sometimes I've written a chapter in my outline that I decided does not need to exist. Sometimes I have a chapter that gets broken off into 2. Usually by the time I've hit the midpoints, I will adjust my outline. So it's not like I stick to this and I do not deviate from it, because the first draft is always going to be discovery writing. I do still really like to have this outline. That's not to say that I write out like all this ideas for scenes and like all the details. I just kind of like to know in general, this is what I want to happen in this chapter. Yeah, my chapter by chapter outline is less about me being like, this is every single scene that's going to happen in the chapter, but it's like I like to write out what my goals for the chapter are. So sometimes I'll just write out things like include a scene that explains this part of the magic system, advance this subplot. Sometimes it's very concrete, sometimes it's very abstract. It really just depends. Part of the outlining process where I give myself the space to discovery write once I actually get to drafting, because there are moments where I don't want to be too prescriptive, and I think characters will tell you who they are as you're writing. Usually Act 1 is a very detailed outline. Act 2 is main beats for each chapter. And then Act 3, sometimes I don't actually write out chapter by chapter, because at this point it's like you're just working towards the end. And I have found that in my previous books, I'm typically not even looking at the outline. Either the outline is not relevant to me anymore, or I just kind of have it memorized and I don't need to refer to it. So I put most of my time and energy into Act 1 and Act 2. And then after all of that happens, finally, I can draft. Every writer is different. I know that this seems like a lot of steps or whatever. And if you like to pants your stories, do it. You should do whatever makes you most excited. I know a lot of writers like to go hit the ground running, and I think that's super fun too. It's not a style that has worked for me. I've tried to do it. For me, when I'm writing a book, and this is just a product of me being like mostly a sci-fi fantasy writer, there is just so much joy that I get out of the planning process. The more I plan, the more excited I am to draft, and it just makes the drafting experience feel very special to me. That is all for this video. I hope it was helpful. I would love to know what your guys' process is for brainstorming, for outlining. Feel free to share down below. Thank you guys as always for watching. I hope all your writing projects are going well. I'll see you guys in the next one.